to another session. This time we're focused on breaking out. How do firms successfully scale beyond a region? Just to give you a little bit of description about this particular panel, and then I'm going to introduce each panelist, and then we'll go from there. So this particular panel explores the critical steps for companies to scale beyond their home region. It's about developing a proof of concept in the domestic market, which is essential, but many firms outgrow those local markets. And to achieve significant scale and growth, they actually need to seek growth nationally and also internationally. So we're going to discuss the challenges and strategies for successful international expansion, drawing on evidence from Canada and Ireland. And so join us obviously now for this conversation to understand how to best achieve your ambitions on a global basis and scale internationally. So I'm going to introduce the panelists that we have today. So first of all, welcome Jory Lamb from VistaView, who's the founder and CEO. So VistaView Solutions focuses on ERP technology and innovation for mid-market businesses in North America. Jory himself holds a degree from the University of Saskatchewan and the Wharton School. Under his leadership, VistaView has received multiple growth and ethics awards, and Jory also advises SAP and the Better Business Bureau. VistaView Solutions as an organization trades a lot in the US. And so Jory is going to be able to share his own perspectives about going global, how that went for him, and all the different pitfalls that came with it. Charles Plant. Charles is a serial entrepreneur, innovation economist, and founder of the Narwhal Project, helping tech startups with funding and scaling. He's co-founded Synaptics and has served as a CFO for numerous tech companies. Charles teaches innovation entrepreneurship with an MBA, CPA, CA, and a PhD in economics. So well qualified to be having this conversation. And for those of you that don't know, a narwhal is the Canadian version of a unicorn. And so I know we're going to probably speak a little bit about unicorn ventures and the difference between those and other sort of high growth ventures as well. Esther. So Esther Tippmann, Professor Esther Tippmann is a professor of strategy and the co-director of the Center for Entrepreneurial Growth and Scaling at the University of Galway. Esther's research focuses on international strategies and scaling digital businesses. She's published in top journals. She serves as a senior editor for the Journal of World Business and has won numerous research awards. So welcome all three of you to this particular panel. Delighted to have you have this conversation. I know at the beginning we said that we would have some lightning talks. So we're going to have 3 to 5 minutes each just to share. It doesn't have to be with a presentation. Some of you I know have put some slides together, which is great. But just to share your own perspective on breaking out, how do firms successfully scale beyond a region? What is it that you've seen from your own experience makes the difference when it comes to this space? So I think we're going to turn to Esther first.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. And I really would like to commend Simon and all the team for this amazing event. I have been able to tune in throughout the day, and really fascinating talks, and I know there's a full program ahead. Yeah, I mean, obviously geographic expansion and global scaling is at the heart of my own research. I also have prepared 1 or 2 slides that I would like to share, though it has been a demanding brief to try to summarize what has been nearly close to 15 years in research into 3 to 5 minutes. But let me put up the slides here. And what I would like to do is summarize it in 2 insights that I would have gained from studying global scalers. Now, I must admit, I would have studied at least in the key study, the top end of global scalers. So they were US SaaS businesses with really ambitious global leadership targets. So they really wanted to be category leader within their markets and do so at global scale. So huge ambitions. And they were also successful in doing so. It is based on research that I would have undertaken together with Dr. Sinead Monaghan from Trinity College Dublin and with Professor Becky Ruber from University of Toronto. But I would like to share 2 insights based on that, because I think these are relevant to hopefully also encourage more Canadian companies, and for that matter, also other companies in other jurisdictions, to raise their ambitions and to break out of perhaps some local ambitions. The first insight that I would like to share with you is that there are industry recipes and there are playbooks for global scaling in this really rapid becoming of a globally leading organization. And these, what we would call industry recipes, contain a couple of rules of thumb that really guide decision making in those organizations and that are consistent with the sector. And because they offer rules of thumb, they generally hold true for most organizations, and they really enable fast knowledge acquisition, fast decision making, and reduce the uncertainty that such a rapid global expansion would entail. And what we would have identified in our research is that when it comes to global scaling, that there are heuristics that relate to the best organizational structure that should be adopted, heuristics relating to location choice. So where internationally should I locate? And also then heuristics related to market selection. So out of those many countries internationally that could be targets, which ones should be prioritized and at what speed? Obviously, knowing those heuristics isn't sufficient. They have to be augmented with specific knowledge to tailor them to the organization. And again, there's a couple of mechanisms here that would work really well in terms of cherry picking skills and contacts, quick cycles of action in terms of small experiments in local markets to really augment knowledge and build local learning. And also then the idea of regulating speed. So really knowing when to pause, when to accelerate expansion, perhaps also when to really slow down. Because I only have a couple of minutes, so I'd like to briefly touch up on our second key insights, which relates to how can business manage that global scaling. And so what is really going on then more deeply within the organization? And really what this is premised upon is just understanding that we gained through studying those companies around what keeps these managers really awake and the leaders awake at night. What are some of the key tensions that they are grappling with as their companies scale globally? And it came down to navigating this tension between the demand for replication and the demand for entrepreneurship. And both were paradoxical. So it wasn't an either or choice, it was on both ends. And both and paradox that both have to be satisfied in tandem. So then I suppose that I will stop here for now because I know I just wanted to plant a seed with a couple of ideas that then also during Q&A we can discuss more as once we've heard maybe from the other panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Esther. Over to you, Charles.
Okay, I'm interested in hearing Esther's research because I spent most of my life inside companies, but I have done a lot of research, and so it always makes me think back of what's going on. I didn't want to use slides today, which I normally use. I wanted to tell a story, and I thought I could tell a story of the founding of Synamics and what we did when we went international. So Synamics was a company I co-founded and was CEO of for 15 years. And we started out close to 40 years ago in telecom software, in a time when people would look at you and go, "What's a software company? And why are you bothering to start something like that?" And we started out with some advice from a person whose name is Bob Furshad. Bob was chairman and CEO of Nortel at the time, one of the world's largest telecommunications companies. So, of course, if you're looking for advice, you can't look in a better place than the CEO of Nortel. And what Bob said, and I remember exactly the wording he used, he said, "Learn to sail in your own bay before you go out into the big lake." And to me, that meant, well, get to a certain size before you start expanding internationally. And so we tried that. We spent many years trying to expand locally. We ended up, I think, with almost every telephone company in Canada as a customer. We ended up with sales across the country, but we kept bumping up against a revenue ceiling. And it seemed that no matter what we could do, we couldn't get beyond that revenue ceiling. What we didn't realize is that we were limited by the size of our market, and our growth had actually been slowed down by entering the Canadian market before going to US markets. And we delayed our US and foreign market entry because of this advice. And so, you know, in the space of a couple of months, myself and my partner, we went to England as the first place because we thought it might be a little friendlier to try. And we were right. It was quite friendly, quite like Canada in the way English people bought. We had early, quick reception and a very large deal, much larger than any deal we'd received in Canada. And so we tried the US as well and made a few sales calls there. And we succeeded very quickly in landing Verizon, Southwest Bell, and Singular as clients, three of the largest telecommunication companies in the world. But to me, selling into the US was totally different than it was selling into Canada. The real feeling of how Americans bought was so different that they were buying aggressively and we were selling in a very friendly manner. So we had to adopt to an American way of selling almost out of the gate. We were very able to do that because we were very confident in the products. We had a long time to get good products into the market, but we hadn't done enough with them. And it was that visceral experience of selling into the US the first time that's really stayed with me. And it's guided a lot of what I've done with something like 20 companies since then, where I've been an officer or a director, and helping them think through their go-to-market and financing challenges is my memory of our success. And very quickly after England and the US, foreign revenue within maybe a year was greater than 50% of our total revenue. And we continue to expand in that way. And, you know, if I'd had to do it again, I wouldn't have started in Canada selling. I would have started the company in Canada, but started selling in the US. And we can get into why and what I found since then later.
That's fascinating, Charles. Thanks a lot from that perspective. And Jory, from a practical perspective, share about VistaFu's development and some key perspectives on this.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, as Esther said, pleasure. Thank you for the invite, and hard to follow these two, so I'll try to be concise. We went first into the US market in 2001. We had a small company. So VistaVu Solutions has been around since 1996 in some form or flavor. In 2001, we had written software for agriculture and basically bumped our head on the ceiling. We had as many clients, not dissimilar to Charles, as we could possibly get that was available to us, and we still wanted to keep growing. So at that time, I was a fairly young guy. I think I still am today, but even younger then, and thought, let's go into the US market. How hard could that be? So not knowing what we didn't know, we actually ended up with a sponsor who brought us down into the US market. And this gentleman was completely connected into that particular space. And so within a span of about 24 months, we grew from about 40 clients to almost 280 clients. We had amazing growth. There was a whole bunch of circumstances that contributed to that. Probably none more larger than the person we hired to lead the software and the sales and the growth in the US. That was a catalyst for our growth. And we also bought out a competitor, and that also fueled some of that growth. Fast forward, we sold that business out. We made just enough money to go and keep working and do another business, not nearly enough to retire. And so we started with SAP, and that's where I think I'd like to spend just a little bit of time. So we started with SAP in 2003. We started in Canada, as Charles said, learn to sell in your own bay before you sell out in the broader waters. I probably got that a little wrong, Charles, but we ended up growing to be Partner of the Year by 2006 in Canada, and thought, let's go into the US. How hard can it be? This time when we went to the US, we did things a little different. First time was a lot harder. This time we went and bought out a couple small providers, and that gave us something really important. It gave us immediate leverage. We could lever the existing clients as references. We could lever staff. We could lever the expertise that they brought, not only for the product, but also for the market that we served. And so we continued to grow and grow and grow. In about 2014, we were sitting at a split of about 60% Canadian, 40% US, largely focused in Canada around energy this time, not agriculture. And when the market fell out, I made a decision that we're getting off this ride, just up, down, boom, bust. So we went out and in 2016, I'd finished my MBA. We raised capital and we went and started buying some of our competitors. And since that time, kind of fast forward to today, over 90% of our revenue today comes from the US. We have 50% of it's recurring, and we serve industrial everything. So distribution, manufacturing, field service, and rentals. So our model, ideally, is revenue in USD, costs in CAD.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jory, for sharing that sort of transition and alluding to the importance of strategic acquisitions to actually achieve that growth and potentially entry into the marketplace. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. I'm probably going to lean a little bit more into Charles and Jory at this stage of the conversation. I'll be coming to you shortly, Esther, as well after that. But you've talked and you've both shared stories about that expansion and the learning you did about scaling from a region. And obviously this region is Canada, but I know that this has broader applicability elsewhere. What are some of the things that you would say are the success factors looking back now that allowed you, A, to identify the right market to go to? So what would you be recommending around how people choose for the first time of moving beyond their nation? But also, what's the entry strategy? And I know there's going to be some common things there, I'm sure, but there will be some more specific things as well, whether it be the US, the UK, or even the Asia market, etc. So I just wondered, Charles and Jory, whether you could share a little bit more insight on that. Maybe Charles, you first. And I know you've got very sort of deep perspectives around the sales and marketing side of things in particular.
Yeah, I spend half my life in sales and marketing and half in finance. So it's a bit of an odd experience. When you say what our strategy was, I don't think we had a strategy. I can see how Jory might have had a strategy because he'd done it before, but for us, this was our first time. We just thought, well, we made sales calls in Canada, we might as well make sales call elsewhere and see what happens. And so literally, the attempt in England was nothing more than making a few cold calls and finding somebody who was willing to talk to us. In the US, I think we did benefit a bit from a relationship that we developed with Nortel in Canada through Bell Canada, who was a customer, to introduce us to a few people in the US. And so that was a quick move there. But we did no thinking about it. In terms of choosing which market to enter, we picked the US and England because they were the ones that spoke English. I've since sold in South America, and it adds to a whole level of complexity to what you're trying to do. And there are enough telecom companies in US and England to keep anybody busy for a long period of time. So it wasn't very much big thinking. But what I did learn there, which was really critical, was that Americans buy for different reasons than Canadians. And so what you learn in Canada is not automatically replicatable inside the United States or in England or in France or whatever other country you go to. There are different strategic pressures, different regulatory pressures, and different scale of operations that make the purchasers enough different that sometimes you're better off not even starting in your own home country if there's enough of a difference there. Because what you learn here, you won't be able to translate quickly over there. You'll have to relearn, and it slows down your growth a bit. So that's the biggest thing I think we experienced, is the different how different the market was. Still telecom companies, still huge behemoths, but they were buying for different reasons and different ways and different time scales, and we had to learn that very, very quickly.
Jory.
Yeah, no, thanks. And again, I think, Charles, we've walked down similar paths, so I appreciate very much your story. For us, second go around, we were a lot more deliberate in going after specific areas. So we bought partners, we bought our competitors in both Texas and in Colorado, and that's where we got our start. And for us, again, I'll just back up the bus a bit. So when we began organically, and that was excuse my phrase, hands and knees across broken glass. That's a lot of heavy lifting back in Canada to get those customers, to get the staff, to build the expertise, to create the awareness, just a lot of effort. So we made the decision to go buy this second time around some of our competitors. And I think how we decided the markets, we were always product specific. So we were offering SAP products and we would go find those partners that might be interested. And acquisitions and integration of acquisitions and valuation of acquisitions, a whole separate topic, but that for us was a catalyst for a launch point into a particular region, physical region. So we started in Texas, then we moved to Colorado. I wrote down a couple things. I think the biggest thing that we had to get right that we didn't when we originally started, you have to have someone that represents your culture in the market. Like for us, we literally the first go around hired, and I'll use a sales rep named Patrick, and we handed him, a phone list and said, go get him, Patrick. But there was no management, there was no staff, there was nothing surrounding him. That was organically us trying to grow, undercapitalized, with no clear support network for poor Patrick, although he did manage to get a few deals. The second go around, we made sure, and we do this every single day, we've done probably 8 to 10 transactions. We need to keep the leaders. We need to keep the staff. If we keep them, then everyone else stays. If you don't keep them, then you've bought a big bag of hammers. And so for us, we have an employee share ownership program that VistaView is 100% employee owned. I think that makes us desirable to someone potentially selling, because not only do they get some shares and a lot of cash, but their staff also gets shares. And if we keep them, we give ourselves a chance to really grow.
Thanks a lot, Jory. And you're echoing aspects that I've also seen when it comes to expansion internationally, that you can't expect to always just do it from your own country. You need to have some boots on the ground. As you say, you need to immerse yourself in that culture. And if you can't do that from a Canadian cultural sensitivity perspective, then you need to find your own skilled expertise in that particular market. Esther, what would be your perspective about what you've just heard from Jory and Charles, which I know are very practical perspectives of the businesses that they've chosen to expand internationally?
They're fascinating stories, and even though they're about, let's say, the Canada, US market entry, they actually do share some similarities even with the North American companies going into Europe. So maybe a couple of reflections. I think this idea of perhaps generating a couple of export sales from your home base. So, you have inside sales and these people are ringing up maybe clients in the US, or be it in Europe or another English speaking country. I think that's typically what we see. And some companies, they would be able maybe to generate up to 5-10% of international sales through that, even in a B2B type of environment. But then there comes the tipping point where it really becomes a strategic decision. Do we want to build out that market? And generate a larger presence, and then the question of boots on the ground or opening an office comes to the fore. And I think both of you, they mentioned really what we would describe as, I suppose, the issue of liability of outsidership. I mean, that's maybe the academic term that we use, but that as a company internationalizing, you are the outsider on relevant business networks, and that becomes especially a challenge. And I think both of you serve business clients. For business clients in particular. So really what you're then trying to do is typically you want to hire someone, or either you have someone, a salesperson that can relocate, that has the relevant networks, but more typically it's really a key strategic hire to try to hire a sales rep in the local market that has the relevant networks to potential client companies that you can tap into to give you those insidership relations. And that was obviously fast track network building. Otherwise, network building, we do know, takes 3 to 5 years, right, to break into those networks yourself. So if you can bypass that, that's worth the investment. I think also this issue of representing your company culture, scale up culture within those local markets, I mean, that's a huge it's absolutely critical. And again, that's something that we would have seen in our companies as well. And how do companies do that? I think it was Jory who mentioned initially, maybe for one of his companies, they tried to send one of their sales reps over, but it only got them so far. Obviously, then if you acquire a company, you can hopefully buy in, or the employees are willing to stay, and you can integrate them effectively in this way, perhaps generate that culture that you would like. But often, I suppose, what we tend to see is, at least for these bigger expansions into Europe, is we do see landing teams, maybe of 3 or so key individuals joining or setting up the operations in Europe. Usually, maybe around three key staffs that are really represent whatever the company is about really, really well. Doesn't necessarily need to be sales staff, but just someone who's really core, who really understands what the culture is about. But what is also important often is that they don't overstay their welcome. So typically after 12 to 18 months, you want them to go back or go on to the next office. And that has to do with really giving this new office the sense of ownership. So at that stage, it should really be set up, the culture should be ingrained, and then it can build and grow out from there. What else? There's a couple of, it's fascinating stories, because I think even in terms of that playbook and that recipe that we would have observed, a couple of commonalities here. Even just hearing you speak about Canadian scale-ups moving into the US, I see a couple of parallels. But Simon, I don't know, there was maybe another specific question that you would like me to come in on.
Yeah, we've got a question from the audience, which I'll ask to address to you shortly, Esther. But one of the things I just want to pick up on is you've mentioned about a landing team. And I wondered, Jory and Charles, is that something you've seen, and Charles, subsequent to leading that organization? But I know all the work you do through the Narwhal project, and you see how tech-based Canadian firms expand as well, not just nationally but internationally, and achieve great success. But have you seen that idea of strategic orientation of taking a landing team, putting them in a market, and getting success from that?
I actually haven't seen that. I've read about companies that have done that. I may have seen it more in Europe than I have in North America. What we did, I was having trouble finding a VP of sales in the US, because at the time it was costing us $250,000 or so. This was 25 years ago, and I just didn't have the cash to be able to pay it out of operating funds. So I went and raised a fairly large Series A round and opened an office in Boston. And I hired a whole team out of Boston to do the work. So instead of taking people down there, we just flew down all the time. It's a quick, easy flight. As long as you aren't from a place, like if you're from Winnipeg or Regina, it might be difficult to get to the US city. But if you're in the East, you can operate the same day basis. So you can send people down all the time. And I've just done that with another company I'm with now. And I arranged for them to hire a US CEO, and that CEO is bringing his whole old team together from throughout the United States. So once again, we haven't taken people down there. We've hired in that market. And, there's a good question of what that does culturally. So I get where Esther's coming from, because you can transplant a culture better if you take some of your own people down there. But I haven't actually ever done it, and maybe I'm more than a dozen times seen the same replication of hire the person in the US and build around that person.
Yeah, I think Charles again. So Esther, first of all, thanks for your insights. I did write down 12 to 18 month ownership and then set them free. I think that's important. I think for us, our governor, and I've said this often to our organization, is our governor to growth is what I would call champions. Like, it's not cash, it's not opportunity, it's not markets, it's not product, it's champions or leadership. And so the decision to go into the US market for us was one that, and you both said it, you have to be all in. So I physically moved to Denver, Colorado, because this was the opportunity for us to go into the US. Up until that point, we had hired locally Patrick, and kind of just set them free. And we got the results we got. But by choosing to move there, I think what we did is we planted a flag in the ground and said, we are committed to this market. This is where we'll win. And then from that, I think, you know, the way I judge acquisitions and the success of an acquisition, how many of those people that we acquired end up in managerial or leadership roles? So certainly there's a cash element or a profitability element that we're looking for. Certainly there's IP, there is talent or specific expertise, but the true measure of success, how many of those people end up in leadership or management positions? And if we find enough of them, we can do all sorts of things at scale.
I just want to pick up on a particular point about when's the right time to go international, because I think some of the personal experiences you've had is you've mentioned around this organic nature of internationalization to an extent. Like the first time I tried it, we made a few calls, we sent someone down there, didn't really work out how we thought it would or that we wanted it to. But then there's the other side of this of strategic acquisitions, recognizing maybe we shouldn't be spending too much time in our home market and investing in the home market. So when you look at this now and this picture now, and if you were advising companies out there that are either in their first market or considering taking their business international, and recognizing, Esther, that the whole body of work around global scale-ups in terms of going global and really doing that from a very early stage potentially, what would be your advice now around how you'd approach it and the timing of going global?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I mean, you could have still new ventures at very early stage before we even talk about scaling that are going international, because this is where they see their customers. This is where they see the viability of the value proposition. This is where they want to build their business model, really experiment and get to product market fit. And that might be in Canada, it could be in the US. I mean, for Irish companies, for example, it's typically is in the US, because the Irish market, the market size will never be able to sustain, at least in tech, on its own, a financially viable company. So I mean, that could certainly be an option, that you start internationalizing really from inception or before you actually launch the venture. And or similarly, you might decide, and that's, I mean, that's typically what many US companies would do, that you have your viable business models, and then you strategically internationalize out of the US, out of North America, perhaps into Europe. I mean, maybe the Canadian story might be interested in to see what you would maybe advise Canadian companies in terms of a good timing for moving. But I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It could make sense at different junctures of the entrepreneurial journey, so to speak. But I think also maybe listening back to Giles and Jory, I think once you do make that move during scaling, I think it is absolutely a strategic decision, and that CEO commitment is huge. Mm-hmm. And it is not always the case. Sometimes maybe international expansion, even in scale-ups, is buried within the business. Maybe it sits, it's not even maybe centralized, or it doesn't even have a seat, let's say at TMT, that there is a VP of global, a VP of international, whatever that is, but it's really a designated role, a strategic commitment at top. And that's signaling by the CEO either to relocate, or as it was in Charles's case, to travel a lot between Canada and Boston and to be there, to be visible. That's huge. And it's similar in companies that maybe make the next leap and go into Europe. It's the same. It's absolutely the same. So we shouldn't take that for granted. That it needs absolute commitment from the top and from the board, and don't house it maybe reporting to a VP of finance or something, or VP of product or VP of revenue. This it simply wouldn't be sufficient, I think, to really succeed. And then, sorry, then maybe also just another note on markets. Even though we study global scaling, typically again, then it's you follow the English speaking language. I mean, that's the most proximate the easier targets. I mean, then obviously it would be the Australian market, maybe other regions in Southeast Asia, but typically it's ex-Japan often and ex-China. I mean, there's certainly certain markets that are a bigger leap of faith, higher risk. So, I mean, you can definitely build a global leader by focusing primarily on the English-speaking markets first. That goes a long way.
Thank you, Esther.
Simon, can I
Charles, please,
can I-
please come in.
Yeah, I want to geek out here for a second because you know, I've spent 20 years doing research specifically to find out what I could have done better at Synamics, and that's been really fun. One of the things that I discovered by accident one day was, and this comes back to, I'm not digressing totally, I want to come back to your question, when do you start going international, is that the average company by the time they IPO gets to 0.85% of their total addressable market. And the range is like Uber's at 0.45% and Dropbox is 2.2%. So when you look at the rate of expansion of a market, it takes about a generation for a market to reach maturation. And so if you want to look at the math of growth, the slope of the growth curve is higher in a larger market than it is in a smaller market. So when you start in a smaller market, you might penetrate when you look at the way the curve slopes in the smaller market, you'll get to the same rate of penetration as you would in a larger market, but it's a lower point in the curve. Why that matters, and this is why I'm geeking out, is that you're able to raise funds based on your growth rate. So the higher your growth rate is, the more funds you can raise. So if you start in a small market and then later go to a larger market, you're going to have a lower growth rate than if you start in a larger market. So if you start in the larger market, you're going to raise more funds, and it becomes additive and accumulative in that you're able to raise more funds the more funds you raise. So those starting out early on locally in a small market, lower growth rates, lower funding availability, and in the long run, and I do something every once in a while. I look back at the last 10 years in a particular. So I look back at all the firms founded in 2008, and there's a high degree of correlation between how much you raise in your first round and how much you raise total overall. So your growth rate is impacted by when you go into what market. And so there are two schools of thought on this. And people say it's easier to start in your own market. And it may be, yes, but in the long run, you're better to have started in the larger market first because you'll grow faster and succeed more in the long run.
Thank you, Charles. Jory, perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think again, there's so much talent right now on this call for everyone who's thinking about getting outside your borders. So thanks, Charles, and thanks, Esther, for your insight. I think for us, our journey was a bit circuitous. It wasn't a straight line. I wish it was. That would have been a lot simpler. I'd be on a beach somewhere, just cashing checks. But for us, I think my experience says, do not underestimate the effort, the time, the amount of dollars that you're going to need to invest to truly be impactful in a market. And I see, it was talked a little bit earlier about kind of people doing this off the side of their desk. Can't do that. At least not for us. You can do it. But for us, it would never have worked that way. Now we chose, there is one reason why I think starting in Canada for us made a lot of sense. First, I always say, and again, I hope this doesn't sound incorrect, but Canada's the audition, the US is the performance. And we had to get it right. Like we had to get our processes right. We had to get our product offerings right. We had to get our, whether it's sales and sales motion or marketing. And to Charles' point, just because you can do it this way in Canada doesn't mean it will immediately translate into the US. It doesn't. But by making sure that we gave ourselves the chance to go into the US on solid footing, it didn't minimize the effort, the time, or the dollars, but it did increase our chances of success.
if I may add to what you both have said, I think it also, I mean, obviously market size is important, but also I think there's also something about maybe the fuzziness or the sophistication of your customers and clients that you can experiment with. So maybe by going to the US or maybe by staying in Canada, maybe you just had equally access or even better access to the most fuzzy customers. I mean, in a good sense, to really get on top of your game before you went to the US. I mean, equally, like, for example, in Europe, we would have companies that are experimenting a lot and are probably at scaling stage that are highly regulated environments around health, where they have to deal with complex health regulation, which is perhaps more lax in the US. But that enabled something to deal with in a very stringent environment to really tease out business models that are suitable and respectful to fussy regulated environments. So again, it might depend. Again, it's not. Yeah, it's perhaps a little bit more nuanced on that one. Where is a good local environment to experiment with their business model, to reach product market fit, and where to go next then in terms of next point of target for expansion.
Esther, I'm going to come to you. You've talked about these paradoxes, or you insinuated about this paradox between ultimately, and correct, you know, I may be butchering this in my explanation, but in terms of the difference between you have to standardize when you go global. There's a degree of standardization and professionalization that has to happen. But equally, in local markets you enter, you need to also be innovative and responsive and flexible. And so this comes together as a bit of a paradox. How have you seen organizations experience that, but also manage that effectively when they're going global and they're in more than just one international market?
Yeah, no, it is tricky. So really, you absolutely rightly said the one strategic need was around the demand for replication. So really trying to standardize the business model that is valid as much as possible. And what that then also means is, as opposed to the way the companies would do that, is typically the senior managers are very much tuned into that need. So it's very much driven top down. So they would pick markets or customer segments in international markets that are amenable for that business model. And certain markets might be out the window because of that, right? Because the business model simply doesn't fit. But it's very much a top down decision. Actually, cultural alignment plays into that as well, because how do you execute that and how do you ensure that standardizing around culture and setting norms and expectations and communicating that clearly and reinforcing that in your international offices is a huge element of that as well. And again, that's very much driven top down. In terms of then the opposite, and then is another element, obviously, then if your business model has very clear processes, standardization of systems and so forth. So a lot comes down to process standardization as well, because they're obviously rolled out internationally as well. Obviously, opposite to that then is this need for entrepreneurship. So to continuously identify and evaluate and exploit new opportunities. Obviously, the market isn't standing still, so we have to also evolve. Interestingly enough, this dilemma between standardization and local adaptation wasn't the one that they struggled so much with, because they tried to minimize the need for local adaptation as much as possible. Obviously, there are certain things where we may have to adapt around, let's say, currency regulation. Charles and Jory, I think you both mentioned around maybe the sales process as well. I mean, sales process, again, it's closest to the end consumer, where we see most variability across different institutional markets and different country markets. So there might be some variation there, but typically the managers didn't struggle so much with that element. It was more so, how do I then, if I'm trying to be very standardized, to roll out my business model at scale and exploit it across markets, how do I remain entrepreneurial? Does that not really drive out any kind of opportunity exploitation? And that was then very much driven bottom up. So really trying to hire young employees in junior roles that have an entrepreneurial drive, but maybe instead of them setting up their own venture, actually happy to work for a scale up. But because they're being entrepreneurial within the confines of standardized processes, it kind of restricts somewhat their entrepreneurial possibilities. But if they come up with new ideas, so you still try to elicit new ideas, but what you try to do is then you filter. You want to filter out those ideas for new opportunities or new processes, new products, whatever that may be, that could lead to replicable solutions. So I mean, for example, if you go into Europe, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of market heterogeneity. So maybe your sales rep for Spain, Italy, UK, they may come up with bells and whistles to adapt, to innovate what you would like to do. But really what you want to do is identify those opportunities that are scalable in themselves, so that you then continuously evolve your business model, and they become standard operating procedures, either in terms of processes or maybe new product features or product diversification. And so really then where both of them come together is this idea of replicable innovation. So in a nutshell, this is how the companies try to do both: replicate, remain entrepreneurial. And as I said, it's a both and. Really this idea of